Briefly, just go back to your National Elderly Insurance Scheme. Your plan will be for a 3% levy. Your main theory as to how to actually pay for this, and that's effectively a 3% tax on everyone, is it? Is that what you mean?
Well, 2 to 3%, but you see, you do it from, you pay it from an early age, and it simply goes into the pool, and over time people say, oh, well, look, we can't have another levy. We've got levies and levies and levies.
Well, people will say it's a tax.
Yeah,
that's precisely as they are doing with this deficit levy that Tony Abbott is talking about.
But they all know they're heading for the old stove roundup, 80 to 100, right? They're heading there. And you see, we've got to think about now. I mean, and this is the problem we have with the Treasury. The Treasury hate tax expenditures. The Treasury is a great Department of State, but it has not a scintilla of imagination. If you ask them to have established our existing scheme, they opposed it all along the way, right? Yet they believe people will just fork out for the pension and live on a lower, less valuable age pension as they age and go to their 80s and their 90s with geriatric care, geriatric assistance, hospitalisation and all the rest. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to provide for it now.
But you're not saying that there's still antagonism in the Treasury to the superannuation system because it's actually money they can't get a hold of, are you?
Yeah, there's antagonism in the Treasury to every tax expenditure that exists, including superannuation.
Let's go to this equity question. You've said that the super guarantee, you've said this in the past, was principally designed for middle Australia, for people earning 1 or 2 times average weekly earnings, and that was the principle behind the Labor government creating a system where better off Australians effectively will get the most benefit from it. Now, why did you do it like that to start with? What was it? Why middle Australia?
Well, this is where this is where the base of most people are. I mean, there's people who were never having enough income, people on, say, 100% of average weekly earnings, 60-odd thousand a year, to 200, 120,000 a year, never having enough spare change to actually do the second rental property, to be able to develop the second or buy shares or margin loans to buy shares. They're never going to have enough spare money. So as a consequence, you know, we've set up a scheme where they can compulsorily save and they get, I mean, what is the key to all wealth, Tony? I'll tell you what it is, compound earnings. Compound earnings. And by forcing people to put the money aside, they end up with a pool of money to use later in life. And that's basically what we proposed, and that's what's happened.
But you know now there are serious equity questions that are being raised about the superannuation tax concessions.
Let me just make this point. There is a view amongst the ACOSs of this world that, you know, it's not doing enough down the bottom, as if super was a welfare scheme. Super was never a welfare scheme. It was always for people on 1 to 2 times average weekly earnings. And I noticed when the Household Expenditure Survey came out recently, the claims of these lobbies were basically found to be false, because when you look at the transfer payments, family assistance, support for kids at school and the rest, we've got a much more even society in Australia than, say, the United States, than, say, Great Britain or any of these countries. So these sort of mealy-mouthed claims by the welfare lobby about superannuation are fundamentally false.
What about the other claims that there are serious equity questions about the superannuation tax concessions, essentially that they benefit wealthy people and they benefit wealthy people in a way to the detriment of poorer people in the society, because that's foregone tax revenue in the budget that could be spent on other things?
Well, Tony, I think there is a very good case to be made about somebody who joins the workforce at 25 and puts their now 9.25% away every week for 35 years, and wealthy people who come in at the end with a self-managed super fund, who have wealth outside of super and then shelter it right in the last 4 or 5 years of their working life. That's not right. That is not right. And you've got all.
Well, that's what's happening though. Well, you've actually got self-managed super funds with $100 million. You've got all the people.
Yeah, you've got all the people out there with, you know, flogging these self-managed super fund seminars. I see a few people I know in journalism these days are out there advertising every day, flogging seminars to sort of suck people into self-managed super. So we've got to be careful. The people who have done the right thing, who save every week and every month for 35 years, they're the people we've got to look after.
But the Treasury's own modelling is fueling this debate, the equity debate. The figures they put out in the MyEFO statement in December show that super tax concessions cost the budget, according to them, this year, more than $34 billion, rising to well over $50 billion in 2016-17.
Yeah, well, of course, they realise now that they've overdone it, and the Treasury is now walking away from those estimates with all speed. They're in reverse gear and backwards. You know, it's like one of those films you see on Fast Time. They're walking backwards in Fast Time because in the January 2014 tax expenditure statement, we have this little phrase. It says, previous editions of the tax expenditure statement have stated that tax expenditure estimates are not strictly additive. For example, because the removal of one tax provision will affect the utilisation and use and for other concessions and for behavioural reasons.
Well, you're going to have to put that in common,
in other words,
in common parlance.
What they do is that they've constructed the straw man phony case. So let's say someone's got make it simple, $100,000. The Treasury says, now, if we didn't have to cover tax concessions for that $100,000 super, and the fact that we are cost X, what would that $100,000 be doing? Oh, it would be in a bank account. Now, in a bank account, let's say it's you, Tony, and you're talking about $100,000. Tony Jones pays his PAYE tax on his monthly income, and out of your after-tax income, you then put the money in a bank account and you leave it there, and the interest is taxed at full marginal rates. So you get taxed at full marginal rates on the way in, and you leave your 100 or your 200,000 sitting in a bank account. The fact is, no one will leave it in a bank account. If the tax concessions weren't there for super, they would be negatively gearing a house. They'd be buying margin loans in shares in Westpac or BHP or the Commonwealth Bank, or doing tax-preferred things. So this sort of simplistic nonsense notion the Treasury have had that the yardstick with which you compare the tax concessions is the simplicity of people simply leaving their money in a bank and paying full marginal tax rates on it is a complete nonsense. So now they're...
Well, I've actually... I'll just interrupt there for 1 minute because I've got the benefit, because you actually did send me these tables before. There is a table that appears in the MyEFO statement that talks about the $50 billion figure being the figure in a couple of years' time, cost to the Treasury.
Yeah.
Then there is the other document that they put out, which seems to undermine that completely. What is actually going on here?
What they've done, they built the straw man, and a lot of people are now running. So you've got journos in the popular debate and people in the popular debate say, well, look, there's 30 or 50 billion here of tax expenditure we could use for something else. This is completely false, completely false. So this is the, I mean, look, experimental estimates of superannuation tax expenditures. I mean, the Treasury's even driven to put out an appendix, experimental estimates. They can't even estimate it. They cannot even estimate it.
These documents, I've got to say, they're quite hard for a layman to understand. But does the Treasury come to a conclusion with how much foregone revenue actually is there because of the superannuation tax concessions?
I'll just read this little bit for the record. It says, this likely change in taxpayer behaviour, the revenue foregone approach does not do this. As a result, it's important to note that revenue foregone, that's a loss to the budget, tax expenditure estimates should not be interpreted as the budget impact or benefit of removing a tax expenditure, i.e. for superannuation.
Okay, so do they come up with any figures?
In other words, the Treasury finally is debunking its own myth about the cost of superannuation. They massively overestimated the cost of superannuation, because if people weren't using the superannuation tax concessions, they'd be negatively gearing a second apartment, a flat, a house, buying shares with margin loans and doing all the things that clever people do.
But do they come to any conclusions at all as to how much is actually foregone in terms of tax revenue? Because the figures of $34 billion this year,
they have,
or $50 billion in a couple of years' time, they're pretty dramatic figures.
They are. I'll find it for you. I've got it here. They say on one basis, it's a cost of revenue of $15 billion on a revenue foregone basis, and on an expenditure basis, it's a gain to revenue of $6 billion. So they've got a minus $15 billion cost of revenue, and a plus 6 billion gain to revenue.
All right.
That's the new
briefly,
estimate.
what do you say?
That's the new estimate.
What do you say has gone on? I mean, you alleging some kind of conspiracy here, or has the Treasury made a mistake and they're now correcting it? What do you think is going on?
Well, look, the Treasury's a one-trick pony, fundamentally. You know, they're always berating tax expenditures, and they've sold the government. The Treasurer produced in the MIEFO statement a $50 billion cost by 2017 of these tax expenditures. In December and in January, the Treasury walk away from their own statement that they've given the Treasurer to publish.
Let's.
You know, I mean, look, if I was still around, I would have massacred them for this, massacred them for it.
You mean actual massacre?
No, I mean, you just wouldn't cop this stuff. You wouldn't cop this sort of sleight of hand behaviour.
All right. We've got a